On February 26, 1959, rescuers searching the remote Ural mountain stumbled upon a sight that made no sense. Half buried beneath the snow stood a tent. But something was terribly wrong. The tent had not been opened from the outside. It had been slashed open from within. Inside, cameras, diaries, boots, heavy coats, and personal belongings were still lying exactly where they had been left. Yet the 9 experienced hikers who had been sleeping there were gone. And they had fled into the freezing darkness wearing almost nothing. Some wore only socks. Some had no shoes at all. Outside, investigators found footprints leading away from the camp. They suggested that the group had walked calmly into the wilderness. Not run. Not fought. Simply walked away. Weeks later, the bodies began to appear. Some had frozen to death. Others suffered horrific injuries. One woman was missing her tongue. Another victim had crushing chest trauma powerful enough to resemble a car accident. And perhaps most disturbing of all, nobody could explain exactly what had happened. More than 60 years later, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in modern history. Because somewhere on that frozen mountainside, something happened that night. And 9 people never came home. To understand why the Dyatlov Pass Incident became so legendary, we first need to understand the people at the center of the mystery. These were not inexperienced tourists. They were some of the Soviet Union's most skilled young hikers. Leading the expedition was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering student with a reputation for discipline, intelligence, and remarkable organizational skills. His friends trusted him completely. In fact, the route itself would later take his name forever. Joining him was 22-year-old Zinaida Kolmogorova, known for her cheerful personality and endless optimism. There was Yuri Doroshenko, who once reportedly fought off a bear with nothing but a geological hammer. Rustam Slobodin, a talented engineer and athlete. Alexander Kolevatov, a quiet physics student fascinated by science. Georgy Krivonischenko, who had worked at secret nuclear facilities. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, one of the strongest members of the group. Ludmila Dubinina, a determined young woman known for her toughness and strong will. And finally, Semyon Zolotaryov. At 38 years old, he was much older than the others. A decorated World War II veteran, Zolotaryov had joined the expedition at the last minute. To some, he seemed mysterious. To others, he was simply another experienced outdoorsman. Originally, there had been a 10th member. Yuri Yudin. But shortly after the journey began, severe back pain forced him to turn around and return home. At the time, he considered himself unlucky. Years later, he would realize that leaving the expedition had saved his life. The group's goal was ambitious. They planned to reach Otorten Mountain deep within the northern Ural Mountains. The expedition was classified as Category 3. In the Soviet Union, that represented one of the highest levels of hiking difficulty. Only experienced adventurers could attempt such a journey. But the team welcomed the challenge. Throughout late January of 1959, spirits were high. Photographs taken during the trip show smiling faces, laughter, and moments of friendship. Nothing in those images suggests fear. Nothing hints at tragedy. To everyone involved, this was simply another adventure. Nobody could have imagined that these photographs would become some of the final moments ever captured of the group. And nobody knew that history was quietly leading them toward one of the most mysterious nights ever recorded. In late January 1959, the Soviet Union was deep in the middle of the Cold War. Far away from Moscow and the world's political tensions, 9 young adventurers were preparing for a challenge that few people would ever attempt. Their destination lay hundreds of kilometers away in the remote northern Ural Mountains. It would be a difficult journey. But to them, it was simply another expedition. The group first traveled by train, laughing, singing songs, and joking with one another. Photographs taken during the trip reveal smiling faces and carefree moments. Nobody looked worried. Nobody looked afraid. After reaching the small town of Ivdel, they boarded an old truck that carried them toward the settlement of Vizhay. Beyond that point, civilization would slowly disappear behind them. The deeper they traveled, the more isolated the landscape became. Soon, forests stretched endlessly in every direction. Snow covered the ground. The temperatures continued to drop. Yet morale remained high. Members of the group kept detailed diaries throughout the journey. Their writings describe laughter, friendly teasing, and the excitement of exploring one of the wildest regions in the Soviet Union. One diary entry joked about the terrible food. Another described singing songs around camp. For them, this wasn't a dangerous mission. It was an adventure among friends. Along the route, they encountered members of the indigenous Mansi people. The Mansi had lived in these mountains for centuries and knew the region better than anyone. Later, rumors would falsely accuse them of attacking the hikers. But investigators found no evidence whatsoever connecting the Mansi to the tragedy. In fact, local Mansi communities later assisted search teams. As the group moved farther north, weather conditions became increasingly harsh. Strong winds swept across the landscape. Snowstorms reduced visibility. Still, nobody considered turning back. They had trained for conditions like these. And their confidence was understandable. These were experienced hikers. Then, something unexpected happened. One member of the expedition, Yuri Yudin, began suffering severe pain caused by chronic health problems. Unable to continue, he made the difficult decision to leave the group and return home. Photographs captured the emotional farewell. The hikers hugged their friend and promised they would see each other again after the expedition. None of them knew they were saying goodbye forever. Years later, Yuri Yudin would become the last surviving member of the original team. He would spend the rest of his life searching for answers. As the remaining 9 hikers disappeared deeper into the Ural wilderness, they continued taking photographs. Those images still exist today. Young faces. Wide smiles. Snow-covered forests. Simple moments of happiness. Looking at them now feels strangely unsettling. Because modern viewers know something those 9 friends could never have imagined. Somewhere ahead of them, hidden beneath the frozen slopes of the mountains, waited a mystery that would outlive them all. And the last photographs taken by the group were growing closer. By the end of January 1959, the group had ventured deep into the northern Ural Mountains. Civilization was now hundreds of kilometers behind them. There were no roads. No villages. No radio stations. No possibility of immediate rescue. Only endless forests, freezing temperatures, and the vast white wilderness stretching in every direction. Yet the hikers remained in good spirits. Throughout the journey, they continued taking photographs. Many of those pictures still survive today. Looking at them feels almost surreal. Young men and women smiling. Friends helping each other through deep snow. People laughing around camp. Ordinary moments. Moments that would later become haunting. On January 31st, the group reached the edge of the highlands. According to their diaries, they established a temporary storage site for extra supplies. The following day, February 1st, they planned to continue toward Otorten Mountain. But the weather began to change. Powerful winds swept across the mountains. Snow reduced visibility. Navigating became increasingly difficult. At some point during the day, the group drifted off course. Instead of reaching their intended destination, they found themselves on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. Translated from the language of the indigenous Mansi people, the name roughly means, Dead Mountain. Over the decades, that name would become famous around the world. But in 1959, the hikers attached no special meaning to it. To them, it was simply another mountain. As evening approached, conditions became worse. Strong winds battered the open slope. Visibility continued to disappear beneath blowing snow. Rather than descending into the protection of the forest below, Igor Dyatlov made a decision. The group would camp directly on the mountainside. Many investigators later questioned that choice. Experienced hikers usually preferred the shelter of the trees. But perhaps they simply wanted to avoid losing altitude. Or perhaps they intended to continue early the next morning. Whatever the reason, that decision would become one of the most debated aspects of the entire mystery. Before settling down for the night, members of the expedition made their final diary entries. Nothing suggested fear. Nothing hinted at danger. There was no mention of strange sounds. No sign of conflict. No indication that something terrible was about to happen. One entry jokingly referred to life in the wilderness. Another spoke about the cold and difficult conditions. Their words sounded normal. Completely ordinary. As darkness fell over Kholat Syakhl, the group assembled their large canvas tent. They cooked. They talked. They laughed. And somewhere inside that tent, cameras captured what would become the final photographs of the expedition. One image shows members struggling against fierce snow and wind. Another appears blurry and chaotic. Some researchers believe it captured nothing more than difficult weather. Others have spent decades searching for hidden meaning inside those shadows. But whatever those photographs truly show, one fact remains undeniable. Nobody in those pictures knew they had less than a few hours left to live. Because sometime during the night of February 1, 1959, something happened. Something so terrifying that 9 experienced hikers would abandon the safety of their tent and walk into the frozen darkness. And none of them would ever return. Before leaving for the expedition, Igor Dyatlov had told friends that the group would send a telegram once they returned. According to the schedule, they were expected to reach civilization again around February 12. But that date came and went. And no message arrived. At first, nobody was alarmed. Delays were common during difficult expeditions. Bad weather could slow progress. Unexpected obstacles could force changes in plans. The families remained patient. Friends assumed the group would return soon. But several more days passed. Still nothing. Eventually, concern began to spread. Parents contacted the university. Students and teachers started asking questions. Something wasn't right. By February 20th, more than a week after the expected return date, volunteers organized search parties. Soon, police officers and military personnel joined the operation. Aircraft were sent to scan the mountains. Experienced rescuers entered the wilderness. No one knew exactly where the hikers had gone. And nobody imagined what they were about to discover. Days later, search teams finally reached the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. At first, there was nothing. Only snow. Endless snow. Then someone noticed a shape partially buried beneath the white landscape. A tent. As rescuers approached, they expected to find 9 exhausted hikers sheltering inside. Instead, they found something that immediately made no sense. The tent was empty. No bodies. No signs of life. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the entrance had not been used. Several large cuts had been made through the fabric itself. But the cuts came from the inside. Whoever had been inside the tent had desperately sliced their way out. Investigators later determined that many personal belongings remained behind. Boots. Heavy coats. Food. Cameras. Blankets. Everything necessary for survival. It looked as though the group had abandoned the camp in a matter of seconds. Even stranger, the snow outside revealed a series of footprints. They led away from the tent. Not running. Not chaotic. Not scattered. The tracks suggested something almost impossible. 9 people had calmly walked away from the safety of their shelter, into the freezing darkness, wearing little more than socks and underwear. Temperatures that night may have fallen below -30°C. Anyone familiar with the mountains knew what that meant. Without proper clothing, death was almost certain. The rescuers stood in silence. Nothing about the scene made sense. Why leave the tent? Why leave behind warm clothing? Why cut through the canvas? And what could possibly frighten 9 experienced hikers enough to abandon their only protection against the deadly cold? At that moment, nobody knew. But the answers waiting beneath the snow would prove even more disturbing. Because the empty tent was only the beginning. The bodies were still out there. And they would soon reveal one of the strangest mysteries in modern history. After discovering the abandoned tent, search teams began following the footprints leading down the mountain. Despite days of snowfall, several tracks were still visible. They stretched for nearly a mile toward a patch of forest below. Eventually, rescuers reached the edge of the trees. And there, beneath a massive Siberian cedar, they found the first 2 bodies. 21-year-old Yuri Doroshenko. 23-year-old Georgy Krivonischenko. Both men were barefoot. Both wore only minimal clothing. And both had frozen to death. Nearby, investigators discovered the remains of a small fire. It appeared that the 2 men had desperately tried to stay alive. But the temperature that night had been unforgiving. And there was something even stranger. Branches high above the bodies had been broken. Some were nearly 15 feet above the ground. It looked as though one of the men had climbed the tree. But why? Had they been trying to spot the tent? Were they searching for something? Or were they trying to escape something hidden below? Nobody knew. Yet the discoveries only became more disturbing. Roughly 300 meters away, searchers found another body. It was Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the expedition. His body lay face down in the snow. One hand was positioned beneath him. The other seemed frozen in place. To investigators, it looked as though he had been crawling. Crawling toward the tent. As if he had been trying to make it back. Days later, another body was found. Zinaida Kolmogorova. She too appeared to be positioned in the direction of the campsite. Then came Rustam Slobodin. He was lying farther up the slope. Closer to the tent. And like the others, he appeared to have been moving uphill. Investigators immediately noticed a chilling pattern. The bodies seemed scattered between the cedar tree and the camp itself. Almost as though the hikers had become separated. Almost as though they had tried to return. One by one. And failed. But there was something deeply unsettling about the scene. Nobody had enough clothing. Some wore only underwear. Others had socks and little else. None carried proper winter equipment. The temperatures that night had likely reached -30°C. Survival under such conditions without protection was nearly impossible. Yet despite the strange circumstances, doctors initially concluded that these first 5 victims had died from hypothermia. Case closed. Or so it seemed. But 4 members of the expedition were still missing. Weeks passed. Then months. Spring slowly arrived. And when the snow finally began to melt, investigators would uncover something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Because the last 4 bodies were waiting beneath the snow. And the injuries they carried would transform the Dyatlov Pass incident into one of the greatest mysteries in history. By March 1959, search teams had already recovered 5 bodies. Official reports suggested hypothermia. Tragic, but explainable. Yet 4 members of the expedition remained missing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the Ural Mountains. As temperatures rose and the snow began to melt, search teams returned to continue their search. Finally, in early May, investigators discovered something hidden beneath several meters of snow. Roughly 75 meters beyond the cedar tree, inside a small ravine, they found evidence that the missing hikers had attempted to build a shelter. Branches had been cut. Snow walls had been formed. The group had clearly been trying to survive. But then came the horrifying discovery. Buried beneath the snow lay the bodies of the final 4 victims. Alexander Kolevatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignol, and Ludmila Dubinina. Unlike the first 5 hikers, these victims were better dressed. Some had taken clothing from those who had died earlier, which suggested something terrifying. At least some members of the group had survived long enough to return to the cedar tree. Long enough to remove clothes from the dead. Long enough to continue fighting for survival. But what investigators saw next would shock everyone. Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignol had suffered severe trauma to his skull. Doctors described the injury as massive. Semyon Zolotaryov's chest had been crushed. Several ribs were broken. Ludmila Dubinina had suffered even more horrifying injuries. Her chest cavity had been severely compressed. Multiple ribs had shattered. The force required to produce such damage was extraordinary. Later, one forensic expert would compare the injuries to those seen in high-speed automobile accidents. Yet strangely, there were almost no external wounds. No deep cuts. No signs of prolonged struggle. No evidence of another person's attack. It was as though some immense force had acted from within. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery involved Ludmila Dubinina. Her tongue was missing. Parts of her lips were gone. Soft tissue around her face had disappeared. Several victims were also missing their eyes. These gruesome details would eventually become some of the most famous aspects of the entire case. Newspapers and conspiracy theorists would spend decades focusing on these injuries. But modern forensic experts would later suggest that natural decomposition inside running water may have caused much of the missing soft tissue. Even so, the injuries themselves remained deeply puzzling. How could 4 hikers suffer devastating internal trauma, while 5 others died from hypothermia? Why did some members appear to survive longer than others? Why had they built a shelter? And perhaps most importantly, what had happened between the moment they abandoned the tent, and the final hours of their lives? Investigators were running out of answers. And then, another disturbing detail emerged. Some articles of clothing taken from the bodies showed traces of radiation. Suddenly, an already bizarre tragedy became even stranger. Rumors spread. Whispers of secret military experiments began to circulate. People started asking whether the Soviet government was hiding something. And before long, the mystery of Dyatlov Pass would become much bigger than 9 dead hikers. Because the strange injuries were only the beginning. The secrets surrounding the case were about to become even darker. As investigators struggled to understand the strange injuries suffered by the final 4 victims, another unsettling discovery emerged. Some of the clothing recovered from the bodies contained traces of radiation. Not enough to be immediately lethal. But enough to raise questions. Questions that nobody seemed eager to answer. Where had the radiation come from? Had the hikers been exposed before the expedition? Was it connected to secret military activity? Or was there a completely innocent explanation? The Soviet authorities offered very few answers. And that only fueled speculation. Several members of the expedition had previously worked in industries connected to nuclear research. Georgy Krivonischenko, for example, had been employed at the Mayak nuclear facility, one of the most secretive locations in the Soviet Union. Some experts later suggested that contamination from his workplace might explain the radioactive traces. But for many people, the mystery remained. And the strange discoveries didn't stop there. As the investigation progressed, rumors began spreading among local residents and military personnel. Witnesses reported seeing glowing orange spheres in the sky around the time of the tragedy. Some described bright lights moving above the mountains. Others spoke of unusual objects appearing in the distance. Years later, similar reports would appear in newspaper articles and personal testimonies. Were they meteors? Military flares? Secret rocket tests? Or simply memories distorted by time? Nobody could say for certain. Meanwhile, Soviet investigators faced another problem. They had no clear explanation. No evidence of murder. No signs of a struggle. No indication that another group had attacked the hikers. No obvious natural disaster. The facts simply refused to fit together. Eventually, the official investigation reached a conclusion. But instead of providing answers, it produced one of the most mysterious statements in criminal history. According to the final report, the hikers had died because of a compelling natural force. That was it. No further explanation. No detailed conclusions. No identification of the force itself. Just 4 words. A compelling natural force. To many people, the phrase sounded less like an answer, and more like an admission of defeat. Then, something even stranger happened. The case was quietly closed. Large portions of the files disappeared from public view. Documents became difficult to access. Photographs vanished. Witness statements remained hidden. For decades, many records were classified by Soviet authorities. And whenever information is hidden, rumors inevitably grow. People began asking dangerous questions. Had the Soviet military been conducting secret experiments? Had ballistic missile tests gone wrong? Was there an undisclosed explosion? Had the hikers witnessed something they were never supposed to see? Some even proposed connections to classified weapons programs. Others suspected radioactive accidents. And over time, the lack of transparency transformed the Dyatlov Pass incident into fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Because secrecy creates a vacuum. And wherever a vacuum exists, speculation rushes in. By the 1960s and 1970s, stories surrounding Dyatlov Pass had grown far beyond the frozen slopes of the Ural Mountains. People spoke of hidden government operations. Strange lights in the sky. Unknown creatures. Even extraterrestrial visitors. But despite decades of rumors and endless theories, one uncomfortable truth remained. No one actually knew what had happened that night. And perhaps the most terrifying possibility of all was that the answer might not involve anything supernatural. Because some experts believed that nature itself could explain the entire tragedy. And if they were right, then the truth behind Dyatlov Pass might be even more frightening than any conspiracy. For decades, countless theories attempted to explain the deaths at Dyatlov Pass. Some blamed secret military experiments. Others imagined hidden weapons tests. Some even suggested paranormal forces. But many scientists believed the answer was far less extraordinary. And perhaps far more terrifying. One of the earliest explanations was an avalanche. At first glance, the theory seemed reasonable. An avalanche could explain why the hikers had cut their way out of the tent. It could explain panic. It could explain why they abandoned their belongings. But investigators quickly found problems. Search teams had discovered the tent partially standing. There was no massive wall of snow covering the campsite. The footprints leading away from the tent were still visible. And experienced hikers like Dyatlov and his friends knew how to recognize dangerous slopes. For decades, many researchers rejected the avalanche theory entirely. The mystery remained. Then, years later, scientists revisited the evidence. In 2020, Russian authorities officially reopened the case. After reviewing decades of material, they concluded that a delayed slab avalanche had likely triggered the tragedy. Unlike the giant avalanches seen in movies, this type of snow collapse could occur hours after the tent had been set up. A relatively small section of heavy snow pressing against the tent might have convinced the hikers that immediate escape was necessary. They cut through the canvas. They fled. And in the darkness, the situation spiraled out of control. But even this explanation faced criticism. Because many questions still remained unanswered. Most importantly, how could relatively small amounts of snow produce such devastating injuries? That question would lead scientists to an unexpected answer. Researchers from Switzerland used computer simulations originally developed to study avalanche mechanics. Their models showed that compact blocks of dense snow moving at sufficient speed could create injuries similar to those seen in car accidents. Broken ribs. Crushed chests. Severe internal trauma. Without necessarily causing extensive external wounds. Suddenly, some of the strangest medical findings no longer seemed impossible. Yet the debate continued. Another theory focused on something even more unusual. The wind itself. Experts proposed the existence of katabatic winds. Powerful streams of cold air capable of descending mountains with incredible force. In Antarctica, such winds have reached hurricane strength. Some researchers suggested that unusual wind conditions may have created unbearable circumstances on the exposed slope. Faced with overwhelming gusts, the hikers might have temporarily abandoned the tent to seek shelter in the forest below. But if that had happened, why didn't they return? Others proposed an even stranger explanation. Infrasound. Low-frequency vibrations generated by specific wind patterns. Sounds too deep for human ears to consciously detect. Some scientists theorized that these vibrations could produce feelings of anxiety, panic, and irrational fear. According to the idea, the hikers may have experienced overwhelming terror without understanding why. Yet evidence supporting the theory remained limited. Many experts remained skeptical. And despite decades of research, no single explanation managed to answer every question. Why were some victims severely injured while others were not? Why had they become separated? Why did some survive longer than others? Why build a shelter in the ravine? Why attempt to return to the tent? Each answer seemed to create new mysteries. And perhaps that is why Dyatlov Pass has continued to fascinate people for more than 60 years. Because unlike many historical mysteries, this one exists in an uncomfortable space. There are no monsters. No ghosts. No undeniable evidence of secret conspiracies. Only fragments. Pieces of a puzzle frozen in time. And the terrifying possibility that 9 intelligent, experienced people found themselves trapped in a chain of events that quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. But even after all these theories, one question remained. Why are people still arguing about Dyatlov Pass after more than 6 decades? And why does this tragedy continue to capture the imagination of the world? Perhaps the answer lies not in the mountains, but in ourselves. More than 60 years have passed since 9 young hikers disappeared into the freezing darkness of the Ural Mountains. Entire generations have come and gone. The Soviet Union itself no longer exists. Technology has transformed the world. And yet, somehow, the Dyatlov Pass incident refuses to fade away. Perhaps because human beings have always struggled with unanswered questions. We crave conclusions. We seek explanations. We want stories to have endings. But Dyatlov Pass offers no perfect ending. Only possibilities. Only fragments. And perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the story so powerful. For decades, one man carried that burden more than anyone else. Yuri Yudin. The 10th member of the expedition. The only person who survived. Not because of skill. Not because of luck. But because illness forced him to turn back. At the time, he considered it a terrible disappointment. He had said goodbye to his friends expecting to see them again. Instead, he spent the rest of his life attending memorials. Reading investigation files. Meeting researchers. And searching for answers that never fully came. In interviews, Yuri often spoke about the unbearable weight of being the only one left behind. He wanted the truth. Not rumors. Not fantasies. Just the truth. But like everyone else, he was forced to live with uncertainty. And he wasn't alone. Families of the victims spent years asking questions. Parents buried children they never expected to lose. Brothers and sisters struggled to understand what had happened. And even after decades, many relatives remained unconvinced that the entire story had been told. Then came the internet. And suddenly, a mystery once buried inside Soviet archives reached millions of people around the world. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. Podcasts explored every detail. Online communities debated theories late into the night. Videos accumulated millions of views. Some people became convinced it was an avalanche. Others believed the Soviet military knew more than it admitted. Some imagined secret weapons. Others pointed toward rare weather phenomena. And a few rejected every explanation entirely. Perhaps that is why Dyatlov Pass remains so fascinating. Because no matter what theory people support, everyone agrees on one thing. Something happened on that mountain. Something terrifying enough to force 9 experienced hikers to leave the safety of their tent and step into temperatures colder than -30 degrees Celsius. And even after decades of scientific studies, government investigations, and endless debate, nobody can say with absolute certainty what they experienced that night. Maybe one day new evidence will emerge. Maybe forgotten documents still exist somewhere. Or perhaps the answer disappeared forever beneath the snow. But there is another reason why this story continues to survive. Because when people look at those photographs, those smiling faces, those young men and women laughing together in the snow, they don't see a mystery. They see themselves. Friends. Dreams. Plans for the future. Lives that should have continued. And perhaps that is what makes Dyatlov Pass so deeply unsettling. Not the injuries. Not the theories. Not the secrets. But the realization that ordinary people can step into an ordinary day, and without warning, disappear into history. Leaving behind questions that may never be answered. So, what really happened at Dyatlov Pass? After more than 60 years, countless investigations, scientific studies, and endless debate, one uncomfortable truth remains. Nobody knows with absolute certainty. And perhaps nobody ever will. Over the decades, people have proposed almost every explanation imaginable. Aliens. Secret monsters. Yetis. Paranormal forces. But despite their popularity, none of these theories are supported by evidence. The facts simply don't point in that direction. What about murder? Investigators found no signs of another group. No footprints. No weapons. No evidence of a struggle. No reason to believe anyone had followed the hikers into the mountains. And what about secret military experiments? While strange lights were reported and Soviet secrecy fueled suspicion, no documents have ever surfaced proving that weapons tests caused the tragedy. In fact, many historians believe the secrecy itself created the perfect conditions for conspiracy theories to flourish. Because when information disappears, imagination takes its place. Which brings us to the explanation supported by science. Today, many experts believe the answer was not a single event, but a chain of events. Perhaps strong winds and worsening weather forced the group into a terrible decision. Perhaps unstable snow threatened the tent. Maybe a delayed slab avalanche convinced them that remaining inside meant certain death. So they acted quickly. They cut their way out, expecting to return within minutes. But in the darkness, in temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius, the situation rapidly spiraled beyond their control. Separated from their equipment. Disoriented. Unable to see. The group reached the forest below. They attempted to make a fire. Some climbed the cedar tree. Others tried to return to the tent. 4 members built a snow shelter in the ravine. One by one, the mountain claimed them. Not because they lacked experience. Not because they made reckless choices. But because nature can be cruel. And because sometimes, a series of small decisions can become irreversible. Perhaps the terrible injuries resulted from collapsing snow. Perhaps the missing soft tissue was caused by months beneath ice and running water. Perhaps the radiation had an ordinary explanation. Piece by piece, science can explain much of the mystery. But not all of it. And maybe that is why people still talk about Dyatlov Pass. Because there is something deeply unsettling about the idea that intelligent, capable people can do everything right and still lose. Maybe we want mysteries to have villains. We want someone to blame. We want dramatic answers. But sometimes reality is colder than fiction. Sometimes there is no monster. Sometimes there is no conspiracy. Sometimes there is only a mountain. And the mountain doesn't care. It doesn't hate. It doesn't forgive. It simply exists. On the night of February 1, 1959, 9 young friends sat together inside a tent on a frozen slope. They laughed. They talked. They made plans for the future. They had no idea they were living the final hours of their lives. No one knew that their names would one day be studied by scientists. Discussed by historians. Debated by millions of strangers around the world. And remembered for generations. Today, visitors can stand in the same mountains. They can see the same snow. Feel the same wind. And gaze across the same endless wilderness. But one thing remains forever out of reach. The truth. Because somewhere between the final photograph, the cuts in the tent, the footprints in the snow, and the silence that followed, the mountain kept its secret. And perhaps, it always will.